in Acts chapter 17. Now, we won't read the whole of the incident. You'll remember it's where Paul was in Athens and he was in front of the great intellectuals of the world there on Mars Hill. And he talked to them. In verse 27, just starting there, reading a couple of verses, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. And particularly verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring, and so on. Now, this is one of those amazing descriptions of Paul's preaching that gives us an insight into the way that God had equipped Paul uniquely for the work that Paul was to do in the time and in the areas in which God had placed him. There was only one Paul, just one of him. No one quite like him. Years ago, I'd a great deal of difficulty in persuading someone on Prince Edward Island that I wasn't related to a Macleod family who owned a store in the rural area of Vernon River. A few days later, I was driving on my own through Vernon River and I saw the store. So, being curious, I went in to see for myself on the pretext of buying a packet of crisps, or as they would say, potato chips. Well, there were three people behind the counter. A woman, a man who looked nothing like me, and another man who was so like me that it was just like looking in a mirror, even down to the clothes and the glasses he was wearing. And I was so shocked I couldn't say a word, just handed over my quarter for the crisps and got out of the shop fast. Amazing. Somebody that much like me, when you'd need to go back to the 13th century to find a common bloodline. But though you may get physical resemblances, people are not carbon copies of each other. And the Bible makes very clear to us that God deals with his people as individuals. He brings them through particular experiences to prepare them and equip them to honor him in the times and situations in which he places them. He gives them particular physical and mental abilities. He places them in particular situations uniquely. Now, look for just a moment at what the Bible tells us about Paul. And remember that the Bible has no unnecessary or irrelevant information in it. Nothing extra there, no padding. Everything it says is significant. In verse 28 we read, as certain also of your own poets have said. Here we've got Paul quoting the Greek poet Aratus from the 3rd century BC, and to be precise, from his much admired work, Phenomena. Now, we're not going to go into the details of all that argument, but what I would like to note is that we're told that Paul quoted this secular Stoic writer and was clearly familiar with what he'd written. And that this was an action on Paul's part which, blessed by God, certainly appears to have struck home with some of those he was addressing. Paul, in his background, in his birth, in his education and experiences, crossed a lot of barriers. And he was equipped uniquely to serve God in the work that God had set for him to do. There was the fact that he was born with Roman citizenship, not just a Roman subject, but a Roman citizen, something only a small proportion of the population of the Roman Empire enjoyed. And it made a real difference as regards freedom of travel, and you know about the tremendous legal privileges and safeguards it gave. Then there was the place of his birth. Tarsus wasn't actually a Roman colony as such, but it was certainly a city with many privileges from the Roman Empire, and a city with wide contact with the world around, one of the great cities of the world of its time, and not only a busy commercial city, but with some of the very best educational facilities in the world. It could compete with Athens, even the very best that Athens could offer, even when it came to debating. And Paul's ability to quote from classical Greek writings makes it absolutely clear that he must have had an excellent classical education. And then there was his religious education, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, the best Jewish education that you could have. Gamaliel's grandfather had been probably the most respected Jewish intellectual of his era, and Gamaliel in turn was widely regarded as the top expert in Jewish learning. Paul certainly wasn't ignorant when it came to the teachings and practices of Judaism. Far from it. And then there was the practical ability that he was given. Paul was able to work with his hands to maintain himself when he had to. It's not all that common, great intellectual ability along with great practical ability, an extraordinary combination. And he could relate not just to intellectuals, as he clearly did in Athens, but to ordinary folk as well. And then there was his cross-cultural ability. People who have moved around the world know that it's sometimes very difficult to adapt to another culture. But Paul could move easily in the Middle East, in Asia Minor. Remember what we read about his letter to the Galatians, that grouping of Celtic origins, tendency to mysticism. He could relate to Greek culture. Well, his performance at Athens shows that very clearly. And not just the sort of intellectual culture of Athens. What about how he related to Corinth? What about the letters that we read to the Corinthians and the sort of problems that he had an insight into and was able to address? And he could deal with the situation in Rome, the capital of the empire, in the time that he spent there, at least nominally in prison, under detention for certainly. He had a unique combination of assets, and he was called on to use every one of them for the work that God had called him to do for the furtherance of Christ's cause and Christ's kingdom. Now, the time that Paul lived in was, of course, a remarkable era. There was a significant amount of relative political stability with almost all of Europe and the whole of Asia Minor and the Middle East and North Africa, all under the political control of the Roman Empire. Communication links better than they'd ever been in the past, as far as land links were concerned, and very good by sea compared to past eras. There was a degree of prosperity in a financial sense. There was an openness, at least a degree of openness to intellectual argument. There was curiosity about ideas that people hadn't been confronted with before. It was a unique situation. And for that situation, God had prepared Paul and equipped him to proclaim the gospel far and wide among people of many different backgrounds and cultures. Paul's own background and education and abilities were a distinctive combination, all of them resources that he held in trust to use them in the furtherance of God's cause. Now, of course, there was no one else with that exact combination of background and abilities. It was God who had prepared Paul long before that confrontation on the Damascus Road. God had prepared Paul to use all the resources that he'd been given in trust, to use them for the furtherance of Christ's cause and Christ's kingdom. There was only one Paul, but there's only one of any one of God's people, each one prepared uniquely to be used for the furtherance of Christ's cause and kingdom in a particular range of situations that God places that particular individual in, to relate to the people around us with understanding and sensitivity, as Paul did, but uncompromisingly in the service of Christ. Paul had sensitivity and understanding. He understood where people were coming from, but he was absolutely uncompromising in bringing the message of the gospel before those among whom God placed him. And may God grant that there might be something of that same approach evident in us, that we might relate to the people that God places us among with understanding, with sensitivity, but uncompromisingly in the service of Christ, looking to God for the strength that we need to do it.
Amen.